Hello. So this is going to be a hands-on video on objects and reference variables. We'll see how to create objects and how reference variables behave. So I hope you have gone through the theory lecture and you properly understand the reference variables. If not, I recommend you go through that video. I'll share the link in the description. So let's start. Suppose we have a class employee and we have to create the object of the employee class. So let's do that. How do we create the employee object? We first of all write the class name, the name of the reference variable. We use the new keyword and again name of the class. That's how we create the object. Now let's say this employee has a single uh, property, an integer property of name ID, for example. So if we try to print the ID of this employee, let's see what happens if we try to print it. We get the output that Java cannot find symbol. The reason is because we have not created the employee class. Every custom class has to be created first. So let's create the employee class in the same package. Let's create the class employee. And as of now, it has a single integer property ID. Now, if we run the same program again, we see the output 0. We have not set the ID property explicitly, but we still see the output 0 because in Java, each reference variable or each object or each primitive variable has a default value. So in this case, because this is an integer property ID, integers are initialized by 0. They have the default value of 0. That's why when we are printing the ID attribute of object E1, we see the output 0. So let's set the ID no one. And if we run the same program again, we see the output 101 as expected. Now let's create another object of the employee class E2 equals to new employee and E2 has ID. E2 is a different employee, so obviously it will have a different ID 103 and we will print the ID of E2 as well. Let's run the same program and we see the output 101 and 103. So we have two employee objects and two reference variables. E1 is the reference variable that is pointing to this employee object and E2 is the reference variable that is pointing to this employee object. And each object has its own ID 101 and 103. So basically we have two objects and two reference variables. Now what happens if we change the ID of E1? So let's say I say E1.id equals to, it's now 105. Would it impact E2 in any way? So if we run the program, we see the first statement prints 101 and 103 because at this point of time, the ID of E1 was 101. But the second statement says that E1.id is 105, E2.id is 103 because we changed the ID of E1. So we see the new value of E1, but E2, there is no impact on E2. E2 is a separate object, and that's why we still see the same value, 103. Now, what happens if we assign E2 to E1? What happens now? If we print again the IDs of E1 and E2, what do we expect to see on the output? So we see E1.id is 103, although earlier it was 101, then we updated it to 105. That's what we saw in the console. But this time we have not changed anything in E1 other than that we assigned the reference variable E2 to E1, and now we see the same value, same as E2. 103 is the employee ID of E2, and that's what we see uh, in the output for E1.id. So what is happening here? Here we are actually assigning the reference variable, whatever E2 is holding, to E1. That means whatever reference E1 had before line number 16, it's lost. It is overridden by the bit value or the link of E2. So now E1 and E2, they have the same bit pattern pointing to the same object. So they both are now pointing to this object. And because this object's ID is 103, that's why E1 is also printing the value 103. Because now there are two reference variables, but they are pointing to the same object. So whatever we change in that object, it will be reflected in E1 and E2. Let's confirm this. So let's say if we change E1.id again to 106, and if we print the IDs again, we see the similar output. We change the ID of E1 to 106, but E2's ID got also changed. Why? Because the reason is same. After this assignment, E1 and E2 are pointing to the same object. And because we changed the ID of the object via E1, but E2 is also pointing to the same object, that's why it is also reflected in E2. So in simple terms, in real life, we don't really say that E1 is a reference variable of type employee. We simply say that E1 is an employee object. Similarly, E2 is an employee object, although technically E2 is just a reference variable that holds a bit pattern that actually points to the employee object. But in simple terms, you generally say that yes, its reference variable is simply an object. So E2 is an employee object. And that's how we create the object of a class, and that's how reference variables behave. Basically their assignment and how uh, the underlying object is, how we access the underlying object and how do we modify the state of the underlying object via reference variables. Hope this helps. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.